Hello, you are watching Pater, the Journal of Solar Culture. My name is CB Robertson, and today I'm joined by my co-host Mark Kelly, the reader of many fine books, and we will be concluding the Odyssey and talking a little bit about Homer generally, while Jack is on vacation in sunny Australia with some of our other members. Um, so, Mark, why don't you, before we get into the content, why don't you give a little bit of an introduction of who you are, and what's been your background with Homer and the Odyssey?
Yeah, my name is Mark, obviously, and I've been in the Order of Fire for 2 years, as of last month, actually. And I'm one of the fire leaders for one of the non-regional groups, you would say. And my background with Homer is actually exclusive to the last 2 years and the Order of Fire. I did not have the opportunity to read them in high school, so I read the Iliad as part of my initial challenge when I joined the order. And then I joined your group to study Homer. We are 1 year in of our 2 years, and I've read the Iliad, you could say 2.5 times now, along with the Odyssey, probably 1.5 times, and a few other books regarding Homer.
Yeah, we've been working through Nicholson's Why Homer Matters, aka The Mighty Dead. We've gotten through that brick of a volume, which is Greg Nodge's The Ancient Greek Hero in 24 Hours, as well as Harmar Brereton's stuff from Scranton University. And Mark is, of course, too humble to talk about how he's been like leading the group consistently and getting through this content ahead of me in many cases. And really cruising through the content. So I'm interested to see what your take is on the Odyssey in general, in addition to these last 4 chapters in particular, which it's kind of sad that Jack isn't here for it, because this is sort of the final resolution of the Odyssey that he was kind of waiting for through these last eight chapters. This is where all the excitement happens. What this whole book, all this dramatic tension and dramatic irony that we've been seeing building up, really in the last 8 books, sort of culminates in. Would you like to walk us through, or would you like me to do the chapter walkthrough?
You'll probably do a better job just because you're more familiar. But I mean, I could take a stab at it if you want.
Sure, yeah. Well, let's go through sort of the events of books 20 through 24, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the themes, some of the scenes and the dynamics that stand out, and then we can maybe take a step back and talk about Homer and in general, and the Iliad and his influence, and go from there.
Sure. So, I'm trying to remember exactly where book 20 picks up, but I believe it's right around the challenge of stringing the bow, where the suitors are all passing around the bow, attempting to string it to see if they have the strength. And there is a bit of an argument about letting Odysseus attempt because he is still disguised as the beggar.
Yes.
And I believe it's Telemanchus. And if I mispronounce the names, please correct me. I'm very terrible with Greek names.
Yeah, no, you're good. Telemachus, like
Telemachus.
there's a moment where it looks like he might be able to string the bow, but then Odysseus gives him that "don't do it" sign, and he's like, "Oh, I guess I can't do it. I guess someone else will have to try."
Yeah. And so he then hands it to Odysseus, who strings it and completes the challenge fairly effortlessly.
Yeah, there's this funny like there's so much foreshadowing here that this when he first is handed the bow, he's looking at it and he's running his hands over his old bow, like refamiliarizing himself with it. And all the suitors are like, is this guy an archer or a Fletcher, like fondling this bow like that? You know, that they immediately notice like something's up with the way that he's handling this thing. It's like he has this familiarity with the weapon that's getting everyone's hackles up, like this is a bad sign of some sort. And
They also Homer also gives you the background and the history of the bow, of how it was gifted to Odysseus.
Yes, that's one of the really fascinating bits of Homeric epic in his style is his tendency towards these narrative digressions of the history of relationships, the history of objects, and the bow is another one of those objects that has one of these backstories that he takes the time to like flesh out how exactly what you were saying. Yeah.
So yeah, from there, I'm trying to remember exactly how it plays out, but it ends up Odysseus reveals his identity, much to the dismay of the suitors and disbelief, and
Yeah.
he launches an arrow into the throat of one of the suitors immediately.
Yeah. And they think he did it by accident. They're like, "Oh, you'll pay for this recklessness." They like even after he's finished the challenge and revealed himself, they're like deer in the headlights. They don't grasp what's happening around them. They've failed to recognize all the signs up to that moment. And then even as disaster is making itself apparent, they still don't recognize the danger they're in. Even after the first one of them has been killed and is like gurgling on the ground, they're like they don't get it.
They don't get it until he tells them, and then they're all very afraid, and in fact start pointing the finger at the dead suitor on the ground and saying
Yes.
he was the one responsible, which
Yes.
I got a little chuckle out of.
Yeah. This I think this highlights this theme of responsibility that we see like throughout the Odyssey, and it goes all the way back to the opening lines, which is describing the comrades, Odysseus's initial comrades, as nepioi, which is like these disconnected fools or idiots, who are not responsible. And Zeus's complaint about how the mortals are always blaming the gods for their own foolish, reckless ways. The comrades it is said of the comrades that their own recklessness destroyed them because they devoured the cattle of the sun. And here we see the sort of parallel of these suitors devoured the food and the house of Odysseus. So now they will pay with their life, just as Odysseus's comrades paid for devouring the cattle of the sun. He is the sun that has returned home now, and he's able to return home because he respected the true sun, so to speak, by care and due respect, but which these suitors did not show. But anyways, a thematic digression. So
well worth it.
Yeah.
From there, I believe that is where the battle ensues.
Yeah, there's like they pull up their tables and draw swords and stuff.
Yeah, and Odysseus empties every arrow into the suitors, and then they grab armor from the storeroom and begin to fight.
Yeah. Oh, on the theme of responsibility, there's a funny, an interesting little anecdote there where they're like, how are these suitors getting this armor? It was supposed to be in the storeroom. Someone must be helping them. And unlike the suitors who immediately tried to point fingers and blame someone else, Telemachus steps forward and said, I must have screwed that up. I'm sorry, I left that unlocked. And he immediately jumps in and owns up to responsibility for that, which is exactly the opposite attitude of the suitors. Just a nice little juxtaposition that Homer offers us between the character of Telemachus and the character of the suitors.
Absolutely.
But anyways,
yeah, and from there, let's skip the battle. I mean, plenty happens in the battle. It's with Telemachus, Odysseus, the swineherd, and I believe the cowherd are all the four fighting together against the suitors.
Yeah.
And kill them all down to the last one. And then they spare there's a couple of like a musician, like a bard of sorts.
Yes, they kill the priest, but they spare the bard. Mm-hmm. And that's it. Many people comment on this choice of Homer the bard to have Odysseus say, oh you were the priest who were making offers and sacrifices for these suitors, praying that I would never return home, weren't you? And then he kills him. But then the bard is a servant of the gods, so he spares him. And it's just an interesting, maybe a self-serving. We might speculate. Of course, the rhapsode puts himself above the priest in relation to the gods. Of course, he does. We might wonder about that, but it's amusing nonetheless.
I guess we could slight segue there into just the importance of the bard in that time period too, because they were essentially the record keepers.
Yes,
there was no, at the time of the events, there was no writing system, or at least not a really well developed one. So it was passed down orally through, and in this case, through song.
Yeah.
And so he's probably wanting to highlight the importance of his own job.
Yes. Well, and it's not without its own little bit of foreshadowing, because after Odysseus spares him in book 20, the bard returns in book 24 with some words to the parents and the fathers of the suitors, who think that they're going to get revenge on Odysseus. But we'll get to that when we get there. So he spares the bard and I think like one or two of the other servants, but he kills all the suitors, and he also kills 12 of the maidservants who had been sleeping with the suitors and apparently insulting the family and behaving insolently towards Penelope and generally siding with the suitors. And the Eurycleia is the one who points them out and says, these are the ones who are being bad and disloyal and all this. It's an interesting subject because it's a big thing that Emily Wilson, one of the more modern translators, makes a huge kind of feminist take deal out of. And there's a lot of like discussion about whether that was justified or was that excessive or was that quite reasonable to do in the time and so forth. But so he cleans house but these 12 maidservants, he makes them clean up the mess of their had been lovers first, and then he takes them out into the yard where Telemachus strings them up. And he has some another big stylistic, somewhat jarring stylistic tendency of Homer is these odd juxtapositions between the poetic descriptions and the things being described. And he like describes the girls as they're being strung up as like in terms of birds that are being attacked by some kind of predator, but also clearly in the wrong, in the same way and sort of in the same camp as the suitors. So after they've cleaned house, basically, he sends Eurycleia up to get Penelope.
And Penelope doesn't believe it.
No, she doesn't.
There's a whole argument between Eurycleia and Penelope where they have a whole back and forth where she just doesn't believe that Odysseus has actually returned home. And eventually she convinces Penelope to come downstairs and see Odysseus. And meanwhile, he's had the house cleaned, and I believe they burned something like a sulfur to purify the house or something like that, essentially restoring order to the house, and then reunite. And she still doesn't believe it's him.
They like sit across from each other, and let me back up for a second because there's another like great little description, and this one I think is more for the women than for the men who read this. But when Eurycleia goes up, the way she describes Odysseus in his appearance to Penelope is like some I imagine this is how they write like romance novels. Like he's standing there like a lion spattered in the blood of the suitors or something. It's this kind of like hot, sexy description of her former husband. And you can almost imagine why Penelope would be like, this sounds like too good to be true. is someone hallucinating or something. But anyways, I like focusing on those little descriptions that he throws in there, the metaphors and the analogies. But yes, so she eventually comes down. She's convinced by Eurycleia, and they sit down across from each other. And both Telemachus and Odysseus accuse her of being like cold and so uncaring to not run to her husband. And she expresses her her reasoning for being distrustful. And then she tests him.
She does, by asking him, I believe it's about their bed frame, which he then describes in detail because he made it himself. And it is very impressive, very heavy, and impossible to move.
And it's built, one of the bedposts is a living olive tree. They literally built the house, the bedroom, around a living olive tree, but still rooted in the ground, still, green leaves and everything. And it's like they would have had a hard time moving this thing. And he's described as being angry when he hears this. Like what did they do to my creation here? Like who wrecked this thing I spent so much time and effort with? I have heard one scholar say it was a very clever test because in those days, gods could disguise themselves as mortal beings. And if a woman, cheated on her husband with a god, like that was not any better. You were still morally culpable, even if you were tricked, even if they took the form of your husband and you cheated on your husband with God. So the gods, being omniscient, would not be angry. They might know about the bed, but they wouldn't be angry that their creation had been moved because they would know in advance. So at least one scholar I've heard describe this as she was, by pushing his emotional buttons, she was not just testing that he was really Odysseus, but testing that but testing that also that he wasn't a god, just maliciously disguising himself as Odysseus. Another sort of point to the cleverness and the matched pair quality of Odysseus and Penelope. Always suspicious, always testing, not fully revealing themselves until they're like certain and ready. It's just a nice little mirror of the character between Odysseus and Penelope together. Yeah, but then, of course, he passes the test by not just revealing his knowledge of the bed, but being angry that there's some chance someone moved this thing and broke his bed. So then they come together and embrace, and he shares his whole story of everything that happened. And so that's sort of the closes that chapter. And then it's the journey to visit Laertes.
Yeah, he journeys out to his father's land and wanders through the orchard to see his father working in the ground, and speaks to him, but his father doesn't know who he is. I believe he sort of has his back turned to him. He's looking down and not looking at who he's speaking to, and doesn't realize that it's Odysseus. And I think he even doesn't recognize him after he sees him until Odysseus says, it's me. Basically says, like, you don't look well. Let's get you bathed and fed and inside.
Well, and Odysseus initially gives him this long alternative story of who he is.
Okay.
Like, he doesn't even reveal himself to his father until his father starts crying and throwing dust in his hair. And like Odysseus is overcome with emotion at that moment. Says, "Father, it's me," basically.
Yep.
But then the bathing happens, and we have this bookend transformative experience where after Laertes emerges from his bath, he's transformed, and Odysseus says, like, you look like one of the immortal gods, younger and stronger and somehow taller. And it's this second or perhaps third instance of there's some familial connection that happens, and then someone is becomes godlike in their visual appearance. It's this persistent themes, both in Telemachus and then in Odysseus, and then finally in Laertes, that nicely sort of bookends the story.
I guess I left that out from the previous book. After Odysseus and Penelope are reunited,
Yes.
He also is bathed and is transformed, and his disguise is removed at that point. No longer looks like an old beggar. He looks like a youthful, strong version of himself. With even that goes down to the detail of his curly hair and how beautiful it becomes after the bath.
Yes, very much. And this is, I believe, if I remember correctly, one of the themes that Nicholson talks about, specifically in relation to a different epic, an Egyptian epic about a sailor, but it applies in Homer too. The bath ritual in coming home, the return home and bathing, cleansing oneself after the journey is like a kind of ritual critical moment of return. It's also one of the things that makes the Oresteia particularly like bitter, because Agamemnon, in his bath after arriving home, that's the moment he's betrayed and killed. It's like in the bath. That's symbolically meaningful in these kinds of stories. Odysseus has a little bit better of time of it. It's a successful nostos, a successful homecoming.
Absolutely. And so after he's reunited with his father, shortly after, word gets out to basically all the family members of the suitors that they were slain.
Yes.
And basically it's pitchforks. Is they're coming for Odysseus is basically the vibe there.
Well, but before we get to the pitchforks, we should mention the arrival of the suitors in hell.
Oh, yes.
Because there after this reunion and Laertes emerges and it's this happy reunion, there's like a cutscene, and who should we find but Agamemnon and Achilles talking with each other in the underworld, and they seem to have reconciled. They're no longer mad at each other. They're just sharing kind of the sadness of being dead and thinking about other things. Agamemnon is just kind of sitting there praising Achilles. Hey, when suddenly the ghosts of all these suitors show up. And Agamemnon's like, what happened to all of you guys? And that's when they reveal, like, oh yeah, we were killed by Odysseus. Maybe we brought it on ourselves a little bit. And Agamemnon's like, oh, that son of a bitch is still alive. We were worried about him, basically.
Yeah, they basically congratulate him. They're like, that Odysseus, good for him.
Yeah, essentially. And it's a funny, it's like the reconciliation we never got in the Iliad is here in the Odyssey. But then we go back to the fathers of the slain, who have armed themselves with pitchforks. But before they venture out, they're rejoined by the bard and by a seer, a priest, who says basically, look, Odysseus didn't kill your sons for no reason. They brought this on themselves, and I saw with my own eyes that he was assisted by a god. Don't go against him. It's not going to go well for you. And that pissed them off. They seem to ignore the bard, Antinous' father in particular. And so they go to meet the Laertes and Odysseus and Telemachus.
And from there, Athena intervenes in disguise as, I forget the man's name, but
is it Mentor again?
Yeah, as Mentor again. Correct.
Okay. Yeah.
And she gives herself away to some extent, where someone calls out, "This is a god. This is not a human." And she essentially reaches out to Zeus to ask what he would do.
Jack is saying, confirming it is Mentor. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And she basically, or Zeus basically says that, kind of leaves it to her to decide. And she then, I forget exactly how, but she ends the feud. I'll let you fill in the blank.
Yeah, well, so one of my favorite bits in all of the Odyssey is this conclusion, this near blood feud that breaks out, because as they're basically on the road walking to this fight, you think of like Montagues and Capulets lining up to fight each other, or like some gangs of New York type lineup. Like Laertes is overhearing Odysseus telling Telemachus, now we're about to go fight. Don't you dishonor us. You act honorably. And Telemachus is like, really, Dad? Really? You think I don't know this already? You don't think I'm not going to prove myself in battle? And you have this glimpse of the grandfather just listening to his son and grandson arguing about honor. And it's like the best possible experience for a grandfather to see his line is like showing itself nobly. And there is a little violence, but it's neither Odysseus nor Telemachus, but Laertes himself, the old man, that gets the spear throw and punches a spear through Antinous' father. And it's like the last hurrah of the old man, that I always thought was very like, yeah, it's violence and a guy dies, but it's a cool little like, oh, the old man still has it kind of kind of experience and event there. And then Athena comes down in this kind of Deus Ex Machina move and just says, stop, none of this is not happening anymore. You will all forget that this was even a thing. Odysseus is in the right, and she just kind of ends it. It's I don't know about you. To me, it was like in some ways kind of unsatisfying as an ending.
Rather abrupt, I would
it's
say.
very abrupt, yes. And you get, it almost felt unfinished in a way, and that in some sense the Oresteia kind of gives a more thematically identical but a more satisfying conclusion to this problem that we were about to have between, in this case, Odysseus and the fathers of the suitors. In the case of the Oresteia, between Orestes and his mother. But that was kind of my feeling about it. Anyways.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. You hit that last line and you're like, okay, that's it. We're done. Okay.
Yeah.
It's kind of surprising. I think, yeah, the Oresteia, the way it ends, it comes to almost a more natural feeling conclusion, even though it is the same ending. And I think partially because it's drawn out in a sort of almost like a trial, right?
It is
a trial. Yeah.
It's the first trial.
Yes. And
if we exclude the Iliad.
Yeah. And I think the trial gives it kind of brings it to that natural conclusion where Athena just ending what would have been a battle abruptly doesn't. At least it doesn't feel like it. Yeah. Even though the conclusion is identical.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Athena
either way,
ending a blood feud.
Yes. Basically. So the goddess of, however you guys saying it, the goddess of civilization, right? She's the goddess of, the patron goddess of Athens, who wants to impose order in a sense, right? She's ending what would have been a blood feud in both cases.
Exactly.
And establishing some sense of, I guess we would say, justice.
Yeah, and what justice means in the case of Ithaca is peace and prosperity. It's like the right order has returned. Odysseus is king. The king has returned. It is the return of the king in the original sense. But with the return of the king, it's also the return of peace, prosperity, vitality, fertility of the land. It's one of the themes that Greg Nage talks about a lot, is how the hero and the body of the dead hero is a source of fertility to the land, to the people that possesses the body, even if the hero belonged to the other side originally. And what we see in this story of the return of the king is like, here's an alternative, maybe better source of fertility and order for the land, for the people, and for the society in general. But yeah, you get the sense, like you were saying before, like they didn't have a written language really at that time. Everything was maintained through this oral tradition, and we have some assumption that these stories were developed through an iterative process over many generations of storytellers. So one of the reasons the Iliad and the Odyssey are very fascinating as written books, because it's a written story from a pre-literate time. So it's like a window into a different mode of storytelling, into a previous pre-literate era.
I think almost 400 years of separation is what's estimated between the time of the events and the writing of the Iliad.
Yeah,
if I remember that right.
And that presumes that the sort of micro events that make up the story didn't themselves predate the Trojan War, which is also possible in many cases, especially when you have like the kind of twin myth that we see in with Achilles and Patroclus. That is very closely tied in with the twin myth from the Proto-Indo-European steppe from circa 5000 BC. Mm-hmm. So there are very, very old story elements that have been worked into what is still an old story, but 3,500 years is a long time.
It's a long time to keep an oral tradition going.
So some of the symbolic and thematic elements in these stories are more distant in the past to the element to the story as it was told by Homer than Homer is to us. Mm-hmm. It's an extraordinary time gap we're working with here. So just interesting things to flag and remember, and maybe investigate if anyone listening to this might be interested in delving further into Nicholson or Greg Nosh or some of these other Proto-Indo-European storybooks like How to Kill a Dragon or The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, things like that. So should we broaden it out at this point? What was your impression of the Odyssey overall as a book?
I like the Odyssey a lot. I enjoy the story. I enjoy the trials that Odysseus goes through, and some of the themes in the book. And I actually did pick up on something I wanted to throw your way and see what you thought of this time reading through the Odyssey. And you actually mentioned it a few minutes ago. You mentioned that Odysseus is compared to a lion dripping with blood and everything else. So I was reading that the other day, and I thought, hey, this kind of reminds me of Book 10 of the Iliad. And so I went and checked it out. It's the night raid with Diomedes and Odysseus when they're raiding the Trojan camp, stealing horses.
Werewolves.
Yes, but the lion reference exists there too.
Oh.
And so for me, it was coming full circle. I thought, hey, this is kind of cool.
Where is it mentioned the lion in Book 10?
I think right around the time they start the killing.
Oh, okay. They're killing is it Thracians?
They were, the Thracians.
I think they stealing their horses.
Yeah, they were prowling like a lion or something like that. Like you basically so it's the same metaphor used in both books. And for me, it was kind of coming full circle for Odysseus because he's stripped of everything on his journey home, and then he gets home and he has to basically reimpose order on his house, and he becomes like a lion doing it as he was at war.
Yeah, it's returning to his old self in some way.
Correct.
Yeah, and there's some connection between the lion and the king at like a symbolic level too. I think which makes not to get too childish about it, but it makes the story of the Lion King feel like a particularly good children's rendition of the Odyssey and the Return of the King. although we don't have to deal with Laertes dying in a tragic way. But Scar is essentially an Antinous type character, and the hyenas eating him out of house and home, and all that. It's I mean, there's a point of a kind of telephone game in storytelling here, where it's actually retelling the story of Hamlet, which is also its own kind of Odysseus play. There's actually a character in Hamlet named Laertes. So Shakespeare knew what he was doing in borrowing Homeric themes, not just themes and characters. He also, interestingly, has a play called Troilus and Cressida, which is about the Trojan War, and like Achilles is a character as and Thersites is like a major character in that play, which is very interesting.
That's cool.
But we're sort of expanding a little bit beyond just the Odyssey and talking about Homer and in general. But I think I hope this walkthrough, for anyone who's followed us all the way through, this Odyssey walkthrough, has begun to get an appreciation of the symbols and the themes, which were sort of original in their time. Just how incredibly influential they have been, not just in Shakespeare and Disney, but in culture generally and in our ideas. And the Odyssey is, in particular, is a story that just seems to keep popping up. We mentioned Watership Down last episode. Have you ever read that by any chance?
No, not yet.
Oh man, it's the Odyssey with rabbits. And you think, oh, it's like a children's story, and it's like there are some brutal deaths in that book. These rabbits. It's a rough story. It's almost not a kid's story. It's so rough in places, but it's a good one for like late middle schoolers, early high schoolers, maybe. There's of course, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And while people often say like the Iliad was like the Bible of ancient Greek culture, I have a very hard time thinking of renditions of the Iliad in culture. There's like Troy, but that's just like an attempt at retelling it. It's not like thematically trying to capture the Iliad. The best I've been able to come up with is Top Gun, which does a pretty decent job. You've got the death of Patroclus, but it's not quite exactly right. It's the withdrawal from combat and then the return, but the withdrawal is kind of for different reasons. There's some crossover elements and themes, but it's not as one-to-one as a lot of the Odyssey renditions.
Mm-hmm.
But the themes are, I mean, in the Iliad, the big theme is heroism and the hero. In the Odyssey, the theme is homecoming, nostos. And one could argue that this is prevalent not just in our literature, but in almost every high school in America, to some degree, in a ritualized, athletic, competitive form.
Definitely.
Which Nietzsche would be very proud of. There's a wonderful essay for anyone who's taking notes and wanting to delve deeper into this, called Homer's Contest. It's like an 8-page read or so. It's like one of Nietzsche's shortest works. It's just a quick little essay about the importance of athletic competition for culture, at least in Greece. And so it's just a nice sort of tie-in. People say, how deep does Homeric themes go in our culture? Well, homecoming in high school might be a Homeric ritual of sorts, including the game and including the romantic get-togethers later.
I don't know if I would have pieced that together myself, so that's pretty neat. But I think the athletic games, were definitely inspired by that time period. Just like the funeral games alone was probably very influential all throughout history, if I had to guess.
Yes, the modern Olympic games we have, is a hero cult practice. Now, the hero in question was a man named Pelops, who's part of the Atreus line, but Achilles and the death of Achilles and the funeral for Achilles led to its own funeral games and funeral game tradition, much like the modern Olympics. They were called the Panathenaic Games, and the like big exciting events. First of all, there was a recitation of the Iliad, which opened the games, sort of a non-athletic thing. But the big event was the what's the word? It was a chariot race, but it wasn't only a chariot race. It was a apobatic chariot race. Am I remembering that word correctly? Basically, you're racing a chariot, and at some point, the rider has to jump off the chariot, hit the ground running, and finish the race on foot. Mm. Apobatic chariot race. That's what it was. Yes.
I think Naj wrote about this.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
That's who I'm borrowing this from.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's portrayed on the amphora in that were unearthed that portray Odysseus at Troy.
Yes, and it was like one of Achilles' like signature moves is the leap from the chariot. That was a sign of his athletic and martial prowess, and they were the apobatic chariot racers were explicitly emulating Achilles in his glory in their competition. So, and we get a glimpse of that with Odysseus among the Phaeacians as well, although that wasn't a funeral game per se.
Right. So I think if you want to do a little contrasting here, some themes between the Iliad and the Odyssey, because I'm now rereading the Iliad again, and I'm rereading a new translation this time, which is fun.
Same here. I'm like one page in.
Okay, I'm on
book
4 now, so I'm not too
this
far.
This is what I'm talking about. Mark's always ahead of the rest of us.
I'm enjoying it. So yeah, I get a little carried away sometimes. But
no, you're good. I need to be where you are.
There's a part in book 3 of the Iliad where, and I'm again apologize for being terrible with names. The king of Troy, who I for some reason cannot think of his name. Priam, yes. He asked for a description of the warriors down on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. And so they're being described, and they come to Odysseus, and he is described as being basically he's described at a previous dinner that happened years ago as being plainly dressed, but once he spoke, no one dared question him again. And in contrast to Achilles in the Iliad, Achilles is obviously the fierce warrior. No one will stand up to Achilles. Even Hector is afraid of him, right?
Yeah.
But to contrast him, that I think is really what the character of Odysseus is doing, is that his character is what he is known for. Even though he is well known in battle, he's clearly fierce like a lion, and known to be capable of killing, but he's really known for his character, who he is, and how well spoken he is. And I thought that was almost a kind of an interesting, I guess you would call it a juxtaposition, but it's a juxtaposition of values, of two things that are equally valued, and almost making a point of both of them.
Yes, and this is one of the themes that Greg Naj highlights in his book, like the best of the Achaeans, is there's this huge question of who's the best among us, and it's a theme that works its way out into the competitive spirit of the Greeks. And Agamemnon is, of course, the greatest by social convention, but Achilles is unquestionably the mightiest. Yet neither Agamemnon's social clout nor Achilles' might is sufficient to take down the walls of Troy. It requires the polytropon cleverness, the nous of Odysseus, to the stratagems and the techne, the skill of Odysseus to take down the walls of Troy. And so there's a case being made in the Odyssey that it is not might or social convention, but this kind of mental prowess, this ability to vacillate between one thing and another in your mind before you decide, your ability to think through things, to strategize, and to decide, to choose, that makes you the best, better even than someone who is naturally mighty or socially, famous and powerful. And there might be some carryover from that valuation into the later development of Greek philosophy, perhaps.
Very cool. I think I appreciate how they've portrayed the two characters, how Homer has done it, both in a way that makes them very admirable.
Yeah. You also, not to bring it back, not to tie everything together in one big knot, but like it goes back to in the Republic, you have Michael Segru is describing the various participants, Glaucon, and Adeimantus, and their characters in relation to Thrasymachus and Socrates and all these others. You begin to get a similar kind of thing with Agamemnon and Achilles and Odysseus. Achilles already said in book 10, like, better to be no man among the living, Otis among the living, than king of the dead, which is what Achilles was. So Achilles is acknowledging the superiority of Odysseus's position. And then in book 24, we get Agamemnon praising Achilles. We get Agamemnon saying, you are such a great warrior. There you were, mega, which Greg Naj very amusingly translates as so huge in your hugeness, but which we could colloquially understand as like larger than life. You were this tremendous being in our eyes. He's describing him in death. He's saying, there you were so huge in your hugeness with the dust swirling around your body. And it's like we have a kind of character arc of growth and a what's the word? A sort of is anagnorisis the word? This moment of recognition that like Achilles realizes that nous is more important than might. And then this moment that Agamemnon realizes that might is actually greater than like fame. There's this alignment of the hierarchy according to what's actually good, not just what seems to be good in the moment. Mm-hmm. And the tragedy is, of course, that these characters, Achilles and Agamemnon respectively, are only realizing this in death, are only realizing this after it's kind of too late. But there's still some closure there. There's still some like, okay, I get it now. And the beauty of reading the classics is there's some chance that the reader might be able to recognize these things before it's too late, before they have to eat the sad meal of the consequences of their own actions, as the suitors and the comrades did.
Mm-hmm. I think in a number, maybe at least twice that I can think of, Achilles is told that people will sing praises of your deeds here. You will go down in history forever. Mm-hmm. And I think it's in book 24 of the Odyssey, I believe Agamemnon says it again. Where what are you upset about? Basically, people are singing songs of your deeds.
Yes.
And in two times, I think he refutes it, and he says, again, what you just said was that it's better to be. Oh, geez, I'm losing the words now, but the point remains: it's better to be alive and well than dead and king of the underworld.
I don't remember how Achilles phrased it in book 24. In book 10, what he basically describes is better to be a servant to a tenant farmer, which is in those days, basically a slave to a slave.
Okay.
Better to be the lowest of the low among the living than king of the dead. And where we see a very interesting inversion of that in somewhat more recent high literature, in Paradise Lost by John Milton. John Milton puts in the mouth of the devil, he says, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. That's what he says, the devil says. But the form is taken straight from Achilles.
Nice.
But it's inverted because the devil is evil, whereas Achilles has recognized what is actually good, which is the sort of Nietzschean embrace of life. And Nietzsche's own embrace of life came in large part from the Greeks. It's questionable whether we would have gotten a Nietzsche without Homer as well.
I think a lot of things would be missing without Homer. There's a very influential,
certainly
pieces.
Very different.
Yes.
Yeah. I should mention just as one more example of Homer's influence that people may not be aware of, but the chivalric code that sort of undergirded the entire knightly nobility of Europe through the Dark Ages and Middle Ages. The idea of a knight and the ideal of a knight was built around 9 models, the so-called 9 worthies. 3 Christians, 3 Jews, and 3 pagans. But the oldest of them, and the first, the model for the knight was a Homeric character. It was Hector. Hector was believed to be the first knight, and the sword of Hector was actually a kind of mystical object that was purported to be owned by some knights thousands of years later that were fighting in Europe. Questionable claim, but as a claim nonetheless. And just one more case of the profound and just once you begin to see these things, explore these things, Homer is everywhere. Homer is the bedrock and the foundation of almost everything in Western culture, and to the degree that you almost can't understand our culture at all without at least a degree of understanding of Homer. Now, I may be overselling it, because the whole point of that is that most people actually already understand Homer, even though they haven't read him. But it's always beneficial to make that a little bit more conscious, to be more aware of it, because it makes you more powerful, and it makes you it makes the world more interesting, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Orville 9999 says, loving the discussion. What you guys got planned next? I'll have to chat with Jack about that. I'm not sure. I think he might have mentioned it, but I've forgotten. We'll have to double check. We've got some interesting stuff lined up, though. Well, we've been going for about an hour. Mark, is there any final thoughts you had about the Odyssey, the Iliad, Homer, his influence, your experience reading these things?
There's a lot of depth to Homer that maybe your first time through you wouldn't notice, and it's good to read it again and perhaps pick up a book by Greg Nage or Nicholson or any other Homer related topics, and read it again through the lens there, because there's much to take out of Homer that is very intriguing and thought provoking. I would encourage anybody to read it. I will definitely encourage my children to read it when they're old enough. But otherwise, specific to finishing the Odyssey, I'm very fond of the last 4 books. It's very satisfying to me. I feel like the Nostos itself is the moment where Odysseus and Penelope are reunited. He is basically, he's returned home. He's taken care of his household. He's restored it to order, and then he's reunited with his wife. That is the Nostos to me. I know all of it kind of is the Nostos, but that moment is kind of the finality of it. and I
Well,
enjoy that part.
and there's almost a sense of unfinished business too, because we never see Odysseus fulfill the prescription by the dead seer Tiresias.
Oh
He
yes.
describes what he must do to his wife. He says, "This is what I must do. You're not going to like it, but I have another mission to do after this." But we don't see that. The story ends before we see how that goes. It's like one last cliffhanger where he's like 99% of the way home, but there's still this sense of, if Tiresias is right, he's not home yet, but the story ends before we get there. So
You can go kind of deep on the winnowing fan part too.
Oh my gosh, yes. I spent years thinking about that, and I still don't have a strong opinion about what that means exactly. It's one of the most cryptic and sort of fascinating symbols in Homer. I mean, there's of course the obvious one, which is like the shield of Achilles, which is, it's more on the nose, but the oar, it's like so many people have thought about this and written about this, and it's, to this day, to me, it's not entirely clear what this oar that is mistaken for a winnowing fan thing means. Maybe someone watching this will figure it out.
It's interesting also, if you take it just at face value, he's on an island, and the island is not large enough for you to walk inland far enough for someone to not recognize an oar as an oar.
Yes.
So you would have to leave the island and walk to the mainland.
Yes.
And walk inland very far, which kind of makes me wonder if it is a reference to something predating Homer that we just don't know about.
One of the theories brought up by Adam Nicholson is the idea that this is some kind of reference to the steppe, Asiatic steppe homeland of the Greek peoples, of the Achaeans, who were Proto-Indo-European speaking people. They were horse raiders from the steppes, kind of like Mongolians almost, but a little bit more European, from Ukraine area, and they migrated out sort of south and west around 5,000 BC or so. So if maybe there's this idea that like the true homeland is the Asiatic steppe, not this island that you've made your home. That's one idea. I don't know if that's compelling or not, but it's one interpretation.
It's fun to explore the idea, and if you do pick up Nicholson and take a look at his writing, you'll see some linguistic ties back to the steppe as well, specific to some of the language used in the Iliad and the Odyssey regarding the ships.
Yeah,
which is also fun.
And the language ties are particularly fun when you think about English, because English, you think, is that's a Germanic language, right? It's descendant from Proto-Germanic, but English has a lot of borrowed Latin and Greek roots. I mean, obviously we're not speaking Greek, but we're speaking a lot of Greek, for the descendants of us, ostensibly more Northern European language. So there's some fascinating tie-ins there, and it's maybe some of this came through by means of Christianity, but maybe Christianity was the Christianity was a Greek speaking language at a time where Homer was very popular as well. Even St. Augustine, when he first read the Bible at like 18, thought, this is obviously inferior to Homer. He later kind of relapsed and changed his mind, but I tend to side with his initial opinion. So, well, cool. I think that's a pretty good place to stop. We've been going for about an hour. This is the conclusion of our walkthrough of the Odyssey. And again, if you enjoyed this, there's so many good resources out there for this tremendously both the most famous story, perhaps in the world, maybe second or third famous story, and yet simultaneously still somehow underappreciated story, given its influence, given its beauty, the skill with which it's told, the developedness of the characters, the supreme genius, literary genius of the 20th century, which is not to say a good writer, but a brilliant writer. Oh shoot, the name is escaping me. The Irishman that everyone dislikes, James Joyce, named his masterpiece Ulysses because he said Odysseus was the most developed character in all of literature. So if you want to read writing at its peak, according to arguably the most skillful creative writer of the 20th century, Homer is the rabbit to chase. It's questionable whether Joyce succeeded in matching the master, but he at least tried, which is something. So, anyways, I feel like that's a good place to conclude it. Thanks so much for listening. Go ahead and like and subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment if you think this is something that other people should see. If you think this is something valuable, more valuable than whatever drama is going on elsewhere online, and tune in next week.
Thank you for watching or listening to the Journal of Solar Culture. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and leave us a comment. The first volume of our journal is available in paperback and now, finally, on Kindle. Pick it up in our store or on Amazon.